I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. I think a good place for us to start is right here.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
That is Malcolm X speaking in 1964 at the founding rally of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. But that speech has a shorthand, right? We know that speech now as the by any means necessary speech. And it is just one of the many, many moments that made Malcolm X just one of the central figures of the civil rights movement in the United States. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, but in the decades that followed, that you've seen his legacy inspire books, inspire movies, inspire music and fashion. He would have turned 100 this year, and today we're looking back at the ways that his legacy has been celebrated and also at times co-opted by popular culture. Joining me now is Mark Anthony Neal, a professor of Black pop culture at Duke University, Sandy Hudson, who's a filmmaker, an activist, and a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada, and Matt Amha, who's a culture critic and a regular right here on Commotion. Mark, Sandy, Matt, welcome to the show, y'all.
How you doing? Thanks for having us.
Hello, nice to have you here. Mark, I'm going to start with you. Listen, Mark, Malcolm X came to prominence at a time when we obviously didn't have social media, no internet. What do you think it was about his understanding of mass media that made him sort of become this iconic voice that we now know?
He came of age in the early parts of the electronic media era, right? He would have watched film as a kid. He would have been a young adult when television became a thing. So he was always sensitive to the representation of Black bodies and Black culture in the context of these films. Just think about Malcolm Little watching a Tarzan movie and trying to put into context, what he was seeing in terms of the way that Africans were treated. But I think more importantly, he was a photographer in his own right. So he was always concerned with capturing and documenting what was happening. And then, of course, the critical moment for him was when CBS News, does their special, The Hate That Hate Produced, which really is the thing that allows us 1959, that allows more of Americans to find out what the Nation of Islam was and who Malcolm X was. He had to learn on the fly how to navigate media culture in that context.
Sandy, I'm curious for you, because you are someone with real life, real world experience being an activist. As you sort of look at the ways that Malcolm X engaged with media, what do you make of the way that he leveraged it?
I think it was wonderful. I think he really understood media. He was the one who said, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And so he really understood the power of media, and he didn't trust it. But that didn't stop him from using the media as a tool for education and to try to influence people to understand his goals and to reach his goals. And I certainly take that lesson from him. And I have tried to use that lesson in my own activism, using the media as a tool for mass education.
Matt, obviously there is something quite intentional about the ways that Malcolm X leveraged media. What do you make of the way that he approached it?
Yeah, I guess kind of building off of the points that have been made. Malcolm was a showman in a lot of ways. He understood the kind of theater of emerging media, which, as Mark points out, at the time would have been color television. I think, he was like a master of spectacle. And that isn't to say that it is in any way shallow, but it's to say that you understand the way that media and public attention functioned, and he understood how to ultimately bend it to his will. And I think was a kind of forebearer in that sense in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I want to just sort of spend a moment on that idea of it being theater, because I don't think you are saying that it's fictitious in any kind of way, but you're saying is that it's a way to sort of like get attention and direct it towards the thing that you want that attention to be, sort of shown on.
Yeah, well, what I mean to say by theater is there's a famous instance in 1957 where a Black man named Hinton Johnson is beaten in Harlem. He takes thousands of Black men from Harlem and marches down to the precinct in his community and stands them outside and makes demands of the NYPD, who eventually yield. But that imagery of having 1,000 Black men or whatever, or hundreds of Black men standing outside of the precinct making this demand of the New York Police Department is a moving image. And there's radicalism is about your belief system, but there's also a kind of aesthetic demonstration of radicalism as well. And the press at the time, and still to this day, often respond to that, right? And he, to me, was a kind of master of using that and turning it on its head, as Sandy says, for the purposes of political education.
So today we're going to look at some of the ways that his legacy has been celebrated, and then eventually we'll get into how he's been co-opted by pop culture. And I think the place to start is 1965, the autobiography of Malcolm X, of course, by Malcolm X and Alex Haley. It was released just a few months after Malcolm was assassinated. Mark, I'll start with you on this one. How big of an impact did that book have on popular culture?
And I mean, I think we need to remember that the majority of Black folks didn't know who Malcolm X was, let alone the majority of Americans, right? And to the extent that they were even invested in his politics in any way, the autobiography really made him famous. He was far more well known after the publication of the biography than he ever was, autobiography, than he was when he was alive. So it became an entry point, obviously, for white America to understand who, quote unquote, this Malcolm X was, who this radical figure was. But it also becomes a touch point for the next 50 years for any young activist or any young Black person, any person of color who is looking for some way to link into a radical legacy. One of the places that you started was Malcolm X's autobiography, right? And that has continued to be the process. I still remember my own reading of it at age 19, sitting on a subway train, going back and forth to work, right? That it was an important entry point for so many folks in terms of his legacy.
Yeah, I think it's not lost on me that there's like a before and after you read the autobiography. I think it sort of changes your understanding of who he is as a figure, but also changes your understanding of what activism is. Sandy, talk to me about the ways that maybe the autobiography sits with you. Oh, I don't know if you can hear me, so I'll go to you, Matt. Tell me about your reaction to the autobiography.
I think I'm not sure there's a single text in like the English language that is responsible for radicalizing and politically educating more young Black people than the autobiography of Malcolm X. You know, like I think that so many of us, to Mark's point, happened upon this text in like a very critical, informative juncture in our lives. And Malcolm was the person that carried us toward radicalism, toward like rethinking your station in life and your relationship to the world. I think to see, I mean, especially for those of us that grow up in the West, and that grow up in so many ways miseducated over here and told that we don't have history, told that our people are hopeless and conquerable. All of the myths that we have projected onto us about ourselves. Malcolm offered us an example of someone that pushed back against it in a forceful way. I think particularly those of us that come from the ghetto, folks in prison, folks stuck working futureless jobs, like that is the core audience for Malcolm's teachings and story, I think, in a lot of ways. But I think I should also say too that I think as a text, it is also not without its issues. Like Alex Haley was a Black man, yes, but I think he's the kind of man that generally looked on suspiciously and even with hostility at times toward young radicals and revolutionaries, of which Malcolm was one. And, the mark of Alex Haley's politics can be found all over the text. He was not a neutral transcriber of events. I think it's the case that Malcolm never even approved the final manuscript before his assassination, right? So like it's been said for a long time that there were elements that Malcolm cared for deeply that were omitted from the text. There was an entire chapter in early manuscript that was this lament against the Black leadership class and Black liberals and integrationists, essentially a critique of Haley's politics that didn't make it into the final edition of the autobiography, right? And so, which is a detail that I'm not sure a lot of people necessarily kind of are contending with in a moment like ours, right? And so, like, while the book is incredibly important, I think it's important to look at it in this canon of kind of literary and political mythology, which is a thing that is said by Peniel Joseph, rather than a work of straight history, right? It's an incredibly important text, but we need to be able to frame it, I think, in that way, and that deepens our understanding of it.
I do think that, the omissions aside, I do think the tension that Alex brings with his politics actually makes the autobiography a more compelling document. I think like the idea that it sort of has a push and pull, but fair enough. I think you may be making the argument that it ends up pulling back too much of Malcolm's politics, and he would have been a more radical document, perhaps, had Alex Haley not been the person to write it. Sandy, I think we have you back now. Let me ask you about where the autobiography of Malcolm X sits with you.
Goodness, it's like such an interesting piece of of literature, a work that I read in my youth as a teenager, and then again at some point in my 20s, and then again at some point in my 30s. You know, it's like I can read it at different points in my life and take different things from it. One of the things that I think is so interesting is that you get to see him develop as a man. You
Hmm.
get to see him change and shift and grow. And I think that's such a wonderful thing that we don't often get to see from figures generally, especially in this Twitter moment where it's like whoever you are, whatever you've said sticks with you forever.
Hmm.
I love that we get to see him change and shift. And that was a conversation that he did have with Alex Haley because, of course, he decides to leave the Nation of Islam while the book is being written and says, I want to change all of this stuff that I had said previously. And Alex Haley convinces him to keep it in. I was also really shocked, I remember, at the sexism in the
Hmm.
book and the misogyny that I felt from Malcolm X. And I felt really disappointed by that. But I think that also shows us that he was a full person, a full and flawed
Hmm.
person.
Hmm.
And it helps us to understand and position some of the elements of the civil rights movement at that time. And most of all, I think it does show that he deeply loved his people.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And, you know, it's very inspirational for sure.
I'm glad that you brought up the sexism and the misogyny because I do think it's too often a part that is overlooked, and I think we are maybe in a moment when we are reconsidering our relationships with important figures and not writing those parts out, right? Like I guess the thing that comes to mind for me is watching the movie Selma, and watching Ava DuVernay just build in the fact that Martin Luther King was regularly cheating on his wife, as to say we can look at the flaws of a person without ignoring that, we don't have to ignore the flaws of a person in order to say, look at all the other things that they did. I want to sort of take a moment here to just recognize the fact that Malcolm X's legacy runs all the way through hip hop. I want you guys to take a listen to his influence across decades of rap.
Our people have a very serious problem. America's problem is self-destruction. That is my self-destruction.
Visions of Martin Luther staring at me. Malcolm X put a hex on my future, someone catch me.
See my vision with a tech, the Malcolm X.
Mind of Malcolm X.
That's like Malcolm X catching a jungle fever.
Oh yeah!
I used to be Malcolm X. Now I'm on the planet as the one called KRS.
Now she's famous and the paparazzi starts to shoot her. I dropped 2 black cars, I named them Malcolm X and Martin Luther. I don't ever play.
Perhaps Drake's not the most credible claim to Malcolm X's legacy, but what you just heard there is a medley of Drake, KRS-One, we had Nas, Rhapsody, Jay-Z, Kendrick, and other 80s rap acts. Mark, talk to me a little bit about his influence across hip-hop.
We talk about the power of Malcolm X's image, his words, but his voice, his sonic quality was also such an important part of why he manifested the way he did.
Yeah.
And in 1980s hip hop, the way that his voice could be sampled and placed into records, I think about the beginning of Public Enemy's Bring the Noise, Too Black, Too Strong. I think about even a group like Living Color, a rock group, their song Cult of Personality opens with Malcolm X, a choice that the group made because Martin Luther King's family wouldn't allow them to use his voice.
Mm-hmm.
It's for many young Black folks, right, who have read Malcolm X. There's no YouTube, there's no Google where you heard Malcolm X's voice were in the ways that it was sampled on actual records or in mixes and clubs and things of that matter. So that was critically important. It's not lost on us that some of those words, by any means necessary, too black, too strong, these kind of nice little catchphrases became what they became because of the way that they were sampled within the culture in the 1980s.
Yeah, there is a cultural production that goes into maintaining our idea of who Malcolm X was and the role that he played. And that cultural production is not just the activism, right? It's the ways that it ends up reverberating through the rest of pop culture. And that's in hip hop, but that's also in movies. And look, we obviously cannot talk about Malcolm X's place in pop culture without mentioning this movie.
These are the questions you and I have to ask. How did we get this mind? You're not an American. You're an African who happens to be an American. You have to understand the difference. We didn't come over on the Nita, the Pinta, and the whatchamacallit. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Landed right on top of us.
Come on. That is a scene from, of course, the movie Malcolm X. That's Denzel Washington. You know that voice everywhere you go. That movie is directed by Spike Lee. It was heavily inspired by that autobiography that we were talking about. Mark, this movie was nominated for 2 Oscars, including Best Picture. A lot of people are like, how did it not win? Also, just hot take, too long. Movie could have used a bit of an edit, Spike. That's all I'm going to say. But regardless, I think the movie did play a really big role, I think, in maybe the commodification of the Malcolm X brand. Talk to us about this moment in transforming our idea of Malcolm X.
Oh, there's no question about that. Again, to the point of when Malcolm X is most well known, I think by the time we get the film in the early 1990s, he is far more well known as a global figure than he ever was any time in his lifetime, and any time in the decade, the 20 years prior to that. The merchandising of it is also becomes an important factor, right? You think about folks who had posters, folks who were wearing little medallions. You think about the Malcolm X caps and the way they show up in the culture. The T-shirts, I mean, walking down Harlem's 125th Street, as I would have at the time, and every one of those street vendors is selling a hat or a cap. They're selling, every kind of cartoon character. Bart Simpson is wearing his Malcolm X hat, right, and an X on his T-shirt. I mean, it was just a crazy moment in that regard. And on the one hand, you understand the value of it, right? Because, it's clear in the way that Malcolm X used media, he obviously wanted his words to be able to spread far and wide, right? Even in the context of his relationship with journalists, anybody who asked him for an interview, he took an interview, right? Would drive hours sometimes to meet with some guy with a little newspaper someplace in Long Island. So he clearly wanted his words to be able to spread far and wide. But the commodification of it says something very different, because are we actually consuming who Malcolm is or was or what his legacy is, or are we just selling and buying stuff because it makes us look politically cool and astute in that particular historical moment?
Yeah, I mean, the success of the movie can't be denied, Sandy, but also it ends up sort of creating not quite a backlash, but a strong response, let's say. There's a pretty strong current of criticism to this movie in the Black diaspora. Talk to us about what some of those criticisms are. Oh, Sandy, I can't quite hear you. Sorry. We've lost sound on Sandy. Maybe we'll get it back in just a moment. Matt, what about you? In terms of as you think about the ways that Malcolm X, the movie, was received, not everybody was happy with that movie.
Yeah. I think, the movie is an interesting one. I think, funny enough, I think as recently as last week, Ryan Coogler referred to it as the greatest ever American film. Yes. And Hollywood was desperate to tell Malcolm's story. Like James Baldwin has written pretty widely about the attempts made by some of the most powerful executives in Hollywood to pressure Baldwin into making a very particular kind of film about Malcolm.
Yes.
A film that Baldwin was desperate to make in his own way, but only if certain conditions were met. Those conditions ultimately were not met, and so Baldwin declined the project, or the project never ended up happening, let's say.
Yeah.
And James Baldwin said famously he did not wish to be party to a second assassination, right? So what we see is Spike Lee eventually kind of resurrecting a version of the thing that Baldwin had refused. And there were, to your point, a number of leaders in the Black arts world that, led kind of resistance movements against the film based on many of the same fears that James Baldwin had expressed 20 years prior. I think namely someone like Amiri Baraka, for example, but there were many others as well.
Sandy, do I have you back, maybe?
You do. Sorry about this.
Welcome back.
Here we are. I was saying that Bell Hooks also was one of the folks who had a really biting critique of Spike Lee's Malcolm X. And one of those critiques, the substance of it was the fact that he decided to focus on Malcolm X's youth for a large portion of the film, and how that was maybe for the entertainment of white audiences in a sort of minstrelsy sort of way, rather than focusing on some of the tensions and his political growth and the sort of decisions that he was making to try to change the political understanding of Blackness among Black people, which was potentially more for a Black audience. And there was also critique about the erasure of the women in his life, how much space the white women took up in his life versus his mother, his sister, who wasn't even portrayed at all, who was a very important figure in his life. And so these are decisions that were made. Personally, I do think, the portion of the book that is his youth is also it's a big portion of the book.
Yeah.
And I do think, it's real that he went through some of these things. I think it's important to understand that. But I think the critique is also quite valid. Like, why focus on this when we could be discussing and hearing about how difficult it could have been during that time to make decisions where there was no playbook. You're
Yeah.
creating this fight back, this movement, and in such a bombastic way.
Well, especially when your runtime is over 3 hours, Spike. Maybe we could have sped that along just a little bit. Mark, what do you make of that criticism?
I think all those criticisms are fair. The one thing I will say is that I think in many ways the focusing on Malcolm X as a young person was helpful because it really does help to humanize him in the eyes of young folks at the time, right? That he could go from where he was to what he became, that he didn't just wake up one day as a radical. And I think there is an important way that we could talk about, and the film doesn't do this very well, we could talk about how he was in fact politicized as a young person, right? Even when he's hustling, right? He's developing a certain kind of race consciousness, about him. The gender critiques are always fair also, right? But I also give Spike a lot of credit for making sure that the film was dutiful to his vision. The studio was pulling money from the project, was not going to give him any more. And he was adamant about filming part of that film in Mecca, right? To capture this transformation of Malcolm X, right? And the story that we often forget were the Black folks, celebrities, right? Folks with money, the Oprah Winfrey's, the Bill Cosby's, folks that we don't normally think about in alignment with the politics of Malcolm X, who wrote checks to allow him to be able to fulfill his vision on how to make that film.
So I just want to sort of go around the table and just do 30 seconds each because we're a little bit running out of time here. But it's not lost on me that there are now more books and films and documentaries and music references of Malcolm X more than ever. These speeches are being shared more than they've ever been shared before. And as we sort of talked about, there's this series, a popular TV series called Godfather of Harlem, which kind of reimagines Malcolm's rise in the midst of a New York City sort of mob war. With all of this said, Matt, maybe I'll start with you. How do you feel about where Malcolm's legacy sits right now in pop culture?
I think it's complicated. I think that like the nature is such that the more that is published on him, the further we get away from him in some way. I think that we have become estranged from Malcolm X, the human being. I think that to a point that has been made prior, like Malcolm's life was kind of split into thirds, and we really only are dealing with one portion of that story. We are really only dealing with Malcolm the firebrand, Malcolm the Muslim preacher. We don't deal with Malcolm the Sunni Muslim. We don't deal with Malcolm the Pan-African. We don't deal with Malcolm the dope boy. We don't deal with El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, which is who he was at the time of his death, right? And we basically suspend him in history in this otherwise brief period in his life, and we're not dealing with the things that are happening around that. And so I think that changes the kind of memory of him, and it changes the relationship that a lot of us have to him. Complicated.
Mark, 30 seconds to you.
Wide and thin. So many more people know about Malcolm X, but actually the context of who he was is absolutely missing in many of those conversations, right? To Matthew's point, I'm so interested, for instance, in Malcolm the father, right? How he functioned as a girl, Malcolm the girl dad, right? What is that legacy in this regard?
Where's that Spike Lee joint? Sandy, 30 seconds to you, pal.
Yeah, definitely agree with what has been said. I think that we've really missed Malcolm the anti-capitalist, Malcolm the socialist, like these really complicated identities in today's world that people would think are complicated were also complicated back then, but he was not afraid to say that these were the things that he were. And, and at a time when people are making a lot of money off of his image, I think that's something to wrestle with. He was an anti-capitalist, and he said that through and through and did not believe that capitalism would survive. So beautiful legacy, but complicated.
I take your point, the idea that Malcolm would have a lot of trouble with the ways that his face adorns posters that are for sale, mugs, T-shirts. This would not make a lot of sense. Mark, Sandy, and Matt, I got to say thank you for this. I really appreciate your time. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yes, of course. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll be back here tomorrow, and we would love to see you then. So see you then. Okay, so we have said goodbye to our radio listeners, but we are still streaming on YouTube. And before we go, I'd like each of you to maybe give us maybe a book or a movie or a documentary, something that, in your opinion, it does justice to Malcolm. It does justice to Malcolm in the idea of, like, that's the Malcolm that feels more wholesome. Maybe each of you can give me a recommendation. Sandy, let's start with you. What do you got?
Oh, I actually, when we talked about this before, I kind of interpreted the question as like something that would uplift what Malcolm was doing, like that was in his.
Bring that in. Let's go.
And so I've got something else that I wanted to say. I wanted to talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Message.
Hey, let's go.
I thought that The Message was such a brilliant book, and it kind of, in the same way that I had said earlier that Malcolm, you can see him grow as a person through the autobiography. I love the way that Ta-Nehisi Coates is like looking back at something that he said in the past that he now disagrees with and wrestling with that in The Message. I think it's such a beautiful book, and it really does do a lot of what I think Malcolm X would be proud of really taking a look at oneself critically and not being afraid to shift and change.
I'm glad that you brought up The Message, because I think it's actually a very valuable example of a figure who, maybe because of the success of Between the World and Me, was co-opted into a story of liberalism that he never signed up for. And I think it sort of like cast a shadow on the rest of his work. And when you see The Message, it's a return to form. It's this return to form of saying, hang on, who am I speaking to and who am I speaking for? And how did this get out of the box of this? And I think so I'm sensitive to that idea of the echo of Malcolm in that. So thank you for that recommendation. Matt, over to you, pal. What do you got?
Yeah, I would say The Sword and the Shield by Peniel Joseph. I think interesting in that it explores the true nature of the relationship between Dr. King and Malcolm X, two men that have been subject to this process of canonization and have been kind of lost in the process, and two men that have been de-radicalized and co-opted, have had their legacies vandalized, frankly, by presidents, by movement leaders, by writers, by thinkers, by journalists. And it kind of reframes the true nature of their relationship, which was fraught at times, but kind of puts them as positions them as counterparts and as peers rather than rivals, which they never were.
Mark, last word to you, pal. What do you got?
Orlando Bagwell's documentary "Make It Plain," which is released a year or two after Spike Lee's film. Watching that documentary, which runs 2 hours, actually gave me a renewed vision of who Malcolm X was. It was a Malcolm that I had never thought about or considered before. And I think it actually is still the very best companion piece to the Spike Lee film.
The thing that runs through everything that you guys are saying is maybe the threat of co-option as a neutralizing force, as a force that, asks you sort of like water down the thing that you're trying to say. And it feels like maybe, Matt, there's a weariness there. There's sort of weariness of saying it gets to a point where a name, particularly a Black liberation name, becomes so big that we no longer hear the thing that they are saying. What is the danger? What happens when we get into that territory?
Yeah, I mean, to get to a point that we were kind of talking about earlier, this is why so much of the space that Malcolm occupies in our culture today is incoherent. Like, that is why, today there are people that believe Malcolm X and Barack Obama to be products of the same tradition. There are people that invoke Malcolm's name in arguments to compel Black people to vote for the Democratic Party. The kinds of things that are historically and politically illiterate if you understand the first thing about Malcolm the man. But because of this process of canonization, because of this kind of historical theft that has taken place, too many people are not familiar with who Malcolm the man was. They only really recognize the iconography.
The similarities run deep, right, between the ways that Che is on T-shirts and on posters, the way that Bob Marley is on T-shirts and posters. These things become sort of fixed symbols, right? They're no longer tied to the original thing that they were saying. They just got to become like you're engaging with the image. You're not necessarily engaging with anything that particular person said. Sandy, go ahead, Mark. It seems like you're going to say something there. Sandy, when you see an image like that, when you see a sort of a distillation of someone like Malcolm X into a sellable product, what comes to mind for you as someone who's right now an activist?
Yeah, man, I think it makes me so sad
Hmm.
because Malcolm X was so much deeper than like this branded X that can be purchased and commodified. I also though think about Malcolm X's um, his analysis of media. I think there is a point up to which we can see if something is popular, if something radical becomes popular, it tells us a little something about what pop culture is looking for, about what pop culture is seeing. And, during 2020, there were echoes of this same conversation of people feeling like, okay, this has gone mainstream, the Black liberation movement. And it was telling us something. I think, Malcolm X being a media, someone who read media quite well, it tells us something about what the culture is interested in and how they are seeing the activism that we're doing. But it's only useful to a point. Once the media takes a hold of that and starts to extract from it, extract our message from our aesthetic, I suppose, and try to really extract us from the essence of what we're trying to do, it becomes a very sad thing because it escapes, our image escapes what we are trying to use our image to do. And so I personally, at this point, the way that Malcolm X is discussed in pop culture, I think it's too far removed from who he is and what he really wanted to express.
Mark, I promise it's the last question and let everybody go. But I think what everybody's kind of reacting to is that there are limits to how much pop culture can actually be a vehicle for carrying radical messages. That is in the nature of popular culture, because once it becomes popular, it is necessarily no longer radical. I think that is kind of a part of the dynamic here. Can you think of figures or artists who've transcended that a little bit, who've sort of managed to be a force in popular culture while actually still maintaining their aura of radicalism or their core of radicalism? Or is pop culture always a watering down force?
Wow. I think it's very difficult to maintain a high level of visibility and be politically astute at the same time. You think about the ways in which many folks will wholly read Beyonce within a political context that she's never ever acknowledged or articulated, right? But just the hyper visibility of her, right? We're in this moment where Black politics is being reduced to Black people who win. And if the expectation is that we're going to find those Black people who win within popular culture, then it's never sustainable. I am much more interested in artists who have a certain kind of integrity about their vision, who they are, what their relationship is to a tradition of Black liberation and Black radical politics, who aren't necessarily articulating that in the context of how many movie tickets they sell, how many streams they have, whether or not they're going to cross over to an audience or not. In some ways, that was always the beauty of Bob Marley before he died, was that he remained true to his political essence. And though there were obviously all these white folks who showed up at the concerts now who were more interested in the guitar solos than they were the lyrics that he was talking about, in some ways he was protected because of the time that he died from blowing up in the way that he obviously would have. Right. When you think about, all these kind of aid concerts in the 1980s and We Are the World, had Bob Marley lived, he would have been on We Are the World. And we would think very differently about Bob Marley, that Bob Marley, than we think about Bob Marley now.
I want to say I'm really grateful for this conversation. I think it has reoriented a lot of things for me because, look, if anybody's listening and they're like, the solution to Black liberation is more Black billionaires, you're maybe misunderstanding the scene. I appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much for your contributions. It's been really thoughtful. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Elamin.
Thanks for
Appreciate it.
having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Mark Anthony Neal is a James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University. Sandy Hudson is a culture critic, filmmaker, activist, and co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada. She was in Los Angeles. Matt Amha is a writer and culture critic in Toronto. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. That is it for the show today. We'll be back tomorrow. I'd love to see you then.